My name's Neil Ryan. I work in the automotive team at Innovate UK. So that's a team that works with OLEV on the low emission innovation programs and also with CCAV on the driverless cars activity as well. I'll start with a very quick apology in that we were expecting somebody from OLEV this morning to do this speech. I literally was either volunteered or pushed about 2 minutes ago to come up and stand up and speak. So it will be very brief, I promise you that. So what I'll attempt to do, without any slides from OLEV, is give a quick introduction to the Road to Zero strategy, which was published yesterday. So I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Has anybody had a chance to look at the Road to Zero strategy? That'll make my life a bit easier. Okay, a few people. So yeah, I've got some notes that just off the press release that I'll try and go through now, because the Road to Zero strategy is very much kind of the underpinning policy that sits behind what we're trying to do with this particular competition. Also, I'll ask for another quick show of hands. How many people were able to join us at the scoping workshops that we ran in April and May? Okay, good. About half of you. Okay, so for those of you that weren't there, we ran some, I think it was 3 scoping workshops. About 250 to 300 people joined us in total to help us kind of finesse the target for this investment, for this competition, to give us some ideas on our initial plans, and then to help us kind of shape the competition, which you'll hear about from Marco and from Zoe later on this morning, which is obviously around 2 specific interventions on supporting innovation in EV charging. So you'll hear more about that from Marco and Zoe later. So in terms of Road to Zero, firstly, for those of you that have not had a chance to look at it, I do encourage you to look at it because it is very much the backbone of what we're trying to achieve with this competition, and it attempts to set out in some detail what the government's strategy is now towards the transition towards 2040, which is where the government has said it wants to end the sale of new diesel and petrol engine cars and some types of van as well. And there's a couple of things that jumped out to me. So I noted down a target between 50% and 70% of all new vehicles being ultra-low emission by 2030, paving the way towards the 2040 target, and very much position the UK at the forefront of this transition, both within Europe but also globally as well. And to back that up, there's something like £1.5 billion worth of government investment in this area between 2010 and what will be up to 2020. So a considerable government investment in this area. And again, this competition is one of the things that's mentioned specifically in that strategy. So there's a whole range of policy interventions within that document, ranging from consumer incentives to support consumers to purchase these vehicles, both cars and vans. There's incentives around home charging infrastructure, and there's policies to support the uptake from local councils as well. So quite a comprehensive package. And again, if OLEV were here, they'd probably do it more justice than me. There's also a key thing that you might want to note is a major EV summit that's being planned for September in Birmingham, which is in the week of the Low Carbon Vehicle Conference. So again, I think there's more details in the strategy, or certainly on the website, as to what that entails. And again, that's another showpiece event for the UK to position itself as a real leader in this transition, in this massive opportunity towards increasingly electrified vehicles. Okay, so I think that's all I'm going to try and do for now, without any slides or without much further preparation. That's probably all I can muster. But hopefully you'll get a chance to speak to the team over the breaks, and we can try and give you some further information. Obviously, Marco and Zoe will cover the competition in more detail in a few slides' time. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so right, I'll hand over to Marco, and we'll jump straight into the wireless charging competition. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Good morning, everybody. I am Marco Lanni, Innovation Lead for EV Charging and Vehicle to Grid in Innovate UK. I'm going to cover the first competition we're talking about today, which is wireless charging for commercial vehicle. Before I start into that, let me just say one thing that I think is paramount to setting the scenes. There is an increasing degree of attention to EV infrastructure. Infrastructure is normally considered a blocker towards the adoption of EV, and that's where these competitions try to focus on innovation to remove some of these blockers. If you have followed what's happening with the events recently, there has been so many events in these past 2 months focused on EV, and they're just going to increase. There's a lot of attention. The market is growing and is forecast to grow even more. So it's even more important to basically solve the problems now so that we can go to the 2040 in a sustainable way and not just in a rushed way. In terms of infrastructure, I just want to start by looking at some of the issues that the current infrastructure, current charging infrastructure has, and that needs to be solved for EV to be a sustainable proposition for customers. So first of all, availability. If we look at urban centers, well, a lot of people don't have access to off-street parking, while close to 90% of charging is still done at home. So a lot of people, if they can, actually it's also a matter of convenience on owning an EV. You can fuel at home. You don't need to go to a fuel station. But that also means that if you don't have an off-street parking, you might not be so enticed into the whole EV proposition. The other thing that is very important is dependability. Well, if you rely on public infrastructure and public infrastructure alone, you need to know that the charging point where you intend to charge is available, is not occupied by other vehicles that maybe are not EV. That creates a lot of social tension. And you need to know that it's working, for example. A lot of charge points are not online here in the UK, so you don't know if the charge point is working, if it's occupied, you cannot book it, and that normally causes a problem. And if we look at this from the business point of view, well, if you are a business relying on EV for your livelihood, think about taxi drivers or commercial vehicles, well, and you need to rely on public infrastructure to charge your vehicle, to fuel your vehicle. If the public infrastructure is not dependable, is not available, well, you probably won't be thinking about using EV in your business because you don't know if your business can continue because you cannot depend on the infrastructure. What we are talking about today is wireless power transfer. I just made a summary slide on what we mean by that. This is not exhaustive by all means. There are other ways that fall into the cable-less charging category. But generally, for wireless power transfer, we talk about either static power transfer, so the vehicle has to align on a pad, so it has to be parked and perfectly aligned on a pad to initiate the transfer. Essentially, you have a converter off-board, you have the pad that generates the induction field, and you have a receptor pad on the vehicle. That's normally static wireless power transfer, but you can also have the so-called semi-dynamic or opportunistic wireless power transfer. This is a project in Milton Keynes in which basically buses pick up some charge, top up a little bit the battery when they stop at the bus stop. And of course, we can go even farther into the future with dynamic wireless power transfer, which is charging on the go. Just a disclaimer, this won't be object of this competition. I will give you some more details later on, but this is not part of this competition. So what are the advantages and issues around wireless power transfer? Well, first of all, you don't have any plug. So you don't have any issue in, for example, different charging standards. You don't have to bring your own cable if you want to charge. If you forget the cable, you can still charge. And this ties in directly with flexibility. If you forget to plug a car when you're parked in a parking spot or close to a EV charge point, if you forget to plug your car, you cannot start charging. But actually, if you have a wireless pad, you can remotely enable that parking spot to start charging your car. Even better, you can repurpose that parking spot. A normal parking spot can become a charging parking spot and vice versa. And the other thing that I wanted to point out, think about what I was saying in the previous slide, opportunistic wireless power transfer. If you do opportunistic wireless power transfer in vehicles that have predictable cycles, essentially you don't need bigger batteries because you will have a longer range simply for the fact that you can top up a specific spot where the vehicle is already stopping. Of course, there are some issues still to be solved, and we hope to be contributing to this with this present competition. First of all, vehicle compatibility. The vehicle needs to be equipped with a compatible pad, which needs to be embedded into the onboard systems. Installation, of course, the pad, as needs to be a pad on the vehicle, there needs to be a pad also on the ground, which basically means installation can require road disruption, and of course it can be expensive. Just to give you an idea of what's happening in the wireless EV charging world, it's not something still at the lab stage, but it's actually something that is going into the market. So in terms of products, there are already some products available. For example, BMW launched this year the wireless pad for charging at home. It's a 3 kilowatt system. Mercedes is doing the same. They are forecasted to launch the wireless pad with their EQ brand next year. This is the sort of the successor of the Zeus project in Milton Keynes, and is an opportunistic charging at bus stop in London. Hyundai, this is the new Kona, and they're working with Wetricity to launch wireless charging too. There is some work being done in terms of standard, trying to sort of rationalize the approach and try to gather the attention of business and the developments towards a single standard. At the moment, it's still just a recommendation, but there is something that basically fixes some of the key points. At the moment, the standard that the recommendation goes up to 11 kilowatts, but some labs like Oak Ridge Laboratory are trying to increase that to 20 kilowatts. And this is just a thought-provoking picture. Is a magnetic cement, it's called Magment, and it's just an idea on how supporting technology can enable wireless power transfer. In this case, basically you have magnetic cement, so you don't need to actually install an entire pad on the ground. You can basically pour it in the form of cement, and then you just put the wiring around it. So just to say how supporting technology can improve the development of wireless power transfer. So what are we talking about today? What is the intended use behind this competition? Well, we are thinking about targeting two specific set of customers: taxi drivers and private hire vehicles, and commercial vehicles. The reason for that, if you take taxis and light commercial vehicles in urban centers, they're responsible for 1/5 of the air pollution in urban centers. That basically means that normally these vehicles are diesel nowadays. They have predictable cycles with frequent stops, but also normally what we see today is that during these stops, the vehicles are left idling, which basically means that they're even more polluting. And if we want to convert this vehicle to EV, well, one of the main blockers to that is the fact that even if you do rapid charging, if you have an EV taxi or an EV delivery vehicle, well, essentially, however long the range is, at a certain point, you will need to stop and charge. And even if you do that with a rapid charger, essentially means that you are eating up that time out of your shift, out of the hour of your shift, which basically means that think about a driver. We did some calculation, I'll present them later, but if you eat 40 minutes a day out of an 8-hour shift, that's basically eating up in their livelihood. And the other thing that we were thinking, given that their cycles involves frequent stops or slow-moving occurrences, actually you could use wireless charging either when the vehicles stop, or for example for taxi drivers as in semi-dynamic wireless, where the taxi creep up in their taxi ranks. And basically, you embed charging or topping up of the battery in their normal cycle. So you add no more disruption in changing from a diesel vehicle to an EV. So I was mentioning a 40 minutes disruption. This is basically just a quick calculation that we did considering a Nissan Leaf, a new 40 kilowatt-hour Nissan Leaf that does 200 miles a day, and you want to charge by 100 miles. Roughly, if you charge at 50 kilowatts, you will need to stay connected for 40 minutes. If you do that over 8 hours, well, you're losing quite a bit of time out of your shift, which basically means either your shift gets longer, or basically you reduce your livelihood directly. The other figure, this is the core issue that we're trying to solve, because if you reduce this time, essentially you can entice more customers to transition to EV. The other figure that I wanted to give is the market value for wireless charging. Well, at the moment, the market value is forecasted to grow at around 50% per year to reach the value of $7 billion globally by 2025. So there's a lot going on. And as we have seen from the previous pictures, a lot of brands are actually thinking about introducing wireless charging for their own products. And just wanted to address two of the criticisms that normally are talked about when we discuss about wireless charging. Standardization, as mentioned before, SA launched a recommended practice, the J2954, that defines some basic criteria for a wireless charging system, as in interoperability, electromagnetic compatibility, EMF, and it does that safety up to 11 kilowatts. So this is basically just part of the recommended practice. The other point that is normally mentioned around wireless charging is about efficiency. People think that wireless chargers are not efficient, but actually they can go up to 88 to 95% to 90, 93% efficiency, which is slightly less than the conductive charging, but not too much. So let's talk about the specific competition. What we are trying to do with this competition is to support new integrated technologies and infrastructure solutions. And the idea is to allow commercial and service vehicles to top up their batteries throughout the day without having to stop to interrupt work to plug and charge. The other key point, so basically it needs to be integrated technology solutions, but the other key point is that what we want to prove is that there are commercially feasible business models that can be embedded for this type of customers and can consider wireless charging for this type of customers. The competition is structured in two phases. This will be a recurring theme today, but essentially what we are presenting here today is the phase one, so the feasibility study stage. The reason why we divided the competition in two phases is that the first phase is just feasibility studies running for 3 months. And the idea is to give confidence not only to technology providers, but also to local authorities and private landowners to have the confidence that this technology and the installation of this technology is sustainable and can be an investable business model. So the idea is that basically we are running 3 months projects for feasibility studies. Those will be between 75 and 120,000 pounds. With a total funding available of £600,000. After that, for people that are successfully apply to feasibility study, they can apply to the phase two, which is basically the demonstration stage. This will have to end, and this is basically a hard deadline, will have to end by the end of the 2021 financial year, so February 2021. Projects are around between 3 million and 9 million, and the total funding available is close to 19.4 million. One thing that I'd like to mention here is that between the two phases, consortium amendments are allowed. So not necessarily the consortium that does the feasibility study needs to remain exactly the same for the demo stage. I'll go through the whole scope. If you have any question, please do ask them in the Q&A session later. So basically, the technology that we are trying, what we are including in scope is technologies that allow static or semi-dynamic wireless EV charging solution. What we are looking for, they need to be clearly tested, have a scalable business model, and where possible, provide insights into the behavior or EV user and all-road user. So essentially what we want to do, we don't want to have beta and untested systems on the road. And one of the key things that our charging infrastructure, we see it before, it can create some social tension. We want to understand not only how users of this specific infrastructure use the infrastructure, but also how other users, other residents might perceive it. Also, it can be, for example, just to give an example of what can be proven, a potential project could demonstrate wireless charging for taxis at locations such as station and airport, or for commercial vehicles, wireless charging at depot or delivery bays. The other important thing is in the phase two, so in the demonstration phase, the hardware that gets installed on the ground is actually certified and safe for all road users. and there needs to be articulated the safety aspects in their application. As we all know, with wireless charging, it's normally kind of a fear-monger among the public. Probably the education around wireless charging is not that up to speed, but normally public is a little bit concerned about EMF and about safety related to wireless charging. Is not the case. We know that is not the case, but it's something that if we can give as much evidence that everything is certified and safe, that can give confidence even not only to the people involved in the project, but also to the wider public. And finally, the project must explain, and this is particularly related to phase 2, what happens to the infrastructure after the trials. The cost, if the infrastructure gets decommissioned, the cost of decommissioning can be claimed as part of the funding. So some considerations over what we will show preference for. Solution that embeds vehicle authentication, metering, and billing. If you think about a taxi driver that charges at a taxi ranks, well, we need possibly the installer or the operator of the infrastructure will need to know which vehicle charged at what time, how much did they charge, and then want to bill them accordingly. The second point is essentially related to the first one. If there is cost in using the infrastructure, that needs to be clear upfront. The infrastructure needs to be easy to use and well integrated with the plug-in infrastructure. Possibly what we wouldn't want to see, particularly in the longer term, is that if you are a taxi driver, you need to have already different cards for membership for plug-in infrastructure, and we wouldn't want to add another number of cards to basically be part of the of subscription to be part of the wireless infrastructure. The project would need to provide safety guidance and instruction for installers if the charging infrastructure is installed under the road surface. And this relates to the fact that if you install a pad and cabling under the surface, there might be other services, for example, telecommunication services running under the same road pavements. And if some other operators for this infrastructure need to operate, for example, on the open reach cables, they need to know where they could put their hands and where they cannot, essentially. And finally, is possibly wherever possible, if there are solutions that are easy to install and upgrade, preference will be shown for this kind of solutions. Just a little bit of disclaimer here. You will find the competition brief, the entire competition brief online. And as you will read there, we decided to embed into the competition a portfolio approach, which basically means that we were trying to look across the projects that better suit the scope and across the two different competitions. So it's possible not only to move funds across the different phases, but also to fund the projects that mostly hit the scope and the original intention of our funders. And also, it's also possible that shifts among the two competitions, this one and the on-street one. Finally, some specific themes that projects can focus on. It's not mandatory, but can focus on. First of all technologies that allow cable-less charging will be considered in scope, so not only induction charging. Vehicle retrofitting is, of course, allowed. Software and hardware development to support demonstrator is already in scope, so will be claimable as part of the grants. This is a question that we heard quite a bit for this competition, but also for the other one. What about smart charging and vehicle-to-grid technologies? Those will be in scope as supporting technologies. So what we don't want to see is for projects that focus particularly on these technologies. But if a consortium wants to embed this technology, for example, to reduce the cost of the infrastructure, that will be completely in scope. Development of supporting technologies, for example, the magnetic cement as shown before or other similar technologies is in scope. And if a project wants to explore multiple locations for wireless charging and how users will use this multiple location, that's considered basically in scope too. In terms of exclusions, what we will not fund is basically projects that seek to implement wireless charging for charge as you drive, so dynamic wireless charging, which basically entails electrification of entire highways or city road lanes. This is not part of the scope. Projects that cause disruption, significant disruption to public roads. Project that targets private users. This competition is specifically for commercial and taxi users. Projects that focus on battery research and development, or that seek to implement wireless EV charging exclusively for autonomous vehicles or as a complement to smart charging and vehicle-to-grid. So essentially, we want to see something that focuses on wireless charging as wireless charging and to try to solve an issue for the referent users of this technology. I'm missing one slide here, but I'll tell you, I'll just speak about it. As part of the competition, and you will see on the competition brief online, we included a data collection provisioning. So essentially what we want to collect is some data on how the infrastructure is used, but also some quantitative data, for example, about how often the infrastructure is used, how much charge is taken from the infrastructure, at which time, which sites are more used, but also some qualitative one, which basically means, for example, if you take a taxi driver, how do they judge the use of the infrastructure? Is it easy for them? Is it understandable? Our other road user, how will they read the infrastructure? How do they approach this kind of technologies? So there is a strawman for the data that we want to collect online in the pages of the competition. Unfortunately, I lost the slide here. But if you have any specific queries, please do ask. But I'll be happy to answer them. And that's all for the wireless one. Zoe, do you want to come and present the...
Okay. Hello. As Marco said, I'm Zoe. I work in our urban systems team where we focus on integrating different city systems such as energy, transport, alongside thinking about citizen-centric design to make cities nicer places to live and more efficient. So this is the second competition within this bundle, and this one's focused on charging it for public spaces. So a bit of background for those of you that weren't at the scoping workshops. Obviously, there's a bit of an issue in that if everyone has an EV, not everyone has a drive to have a nice charging point, especially in cities. And as you get more urban, there's a lot less space to be able to charge. And for us to have mass uptake of EVs, we need to have convenient, safe charging options. And despite OLEV putting out a decent amount of money for local authorities to take up to implement charging infrastructure, only a small amount of that has been taken up so far by local authorities. So we need to understand why, what the barriers are there, and make sure that the solutions for charging infrastructure work for the areas where they're being implemented, and we're potentially in a position where we can co-create the solutions with local authorities that they're comfortable and ready to uptake them for their areas. So now, if you don't have a charging point, we're doing some pretty unsafe things like putting charging down the street if you can't park right outside your home, or if you're not on the first floor, you might have to make a zip line down to your car to be able to charge it, which all seem like funny, but are actually things that are happening and are pretty dangerous if this happens often. And will end up probably falling onto the local authority's lap when someone gets hurt by it. So on that, thinking about how we design this and the fact that unlike charging, refueling your car, normally that's done somewhere that's not public space. EV charging tends to happen in public spaces. And at a time when we're being told to not have street clutter and fill up the streets with things that aren't for pedestrians who are supposed to come first, this is a bit of an issue. And you don't have to look very far on Twitter to find examples of people that have accessibility issues kind of calling out some of these things. Obviously, this isn't being used quite correctly. This one's outside DFT's office, so OLEV aren't here, so it's fine. But again, you can see that's pretty hard to navigate if you can't see a cable hanging in the street. How are you going to walk over that? Again, there's been quite a lot of calls for Royal National Institute of the Blind to do something about this, and they've been engaged with some of DFT's consultations. And again, thinking about who's using the space when you're installing things. If you're in a wheelchair or pushing a pram, the only way you're going to continue your journey down that street is to get in the middle of the road and then get back on the pavement, which isn't really fair. So for the market opportunity, again, it's pretty big. Bringing together the market for EV charging, which is big in its own right, but also looking at the kind of smart cities market and urban design. There's a lot of enormous numbers around that. For example, nearly 3 trillion by 2025. But the UK has some really good expertise in that space, so if we can bring that together with those working in EV charging and that space, then we could really develop some good solutions that are exportable. So, the competition. Similarly to the wireless, this is in 2 phases. The only difference here is there's a little bit of difference in the amount of money between phase 1 and phase 2. So again, the phase 1 having feasibility studies was influenced quite heavily at the scoping workshops, especially for this call where local authorities will need to be involved in some manner for planning permissions and that kind of thing and understanding where to implement infrastructure. There was a big need to have some kind of feasibility study because a lot of local authorities and people that might be project partners aren't in a position right now where they understand where charging infrastructure needs to go and what needs to be done. So again, hard deadlines of projects needing to end by March 2019 for the 3-month feasibility study and by February 2021 for the demonstration stage. And again, the only difference is the funding split is a little bit different. So project consortia, the projects must be collaborative and business-led, so that means you need at least 2 partners within the project claiming grant. And we're hoping to see projects that span across the value chain, so all the way from urban design and planning through to hardware manufacturers, energy providers. This is a chance to kind of think outside the box in how we're implementing charging infrastructure and think a little differently to the things we've done already. And again, we're really encouraging you to include the local authority or council on your project team where relevant. And that might be in different capacities as fully engaged project partners, but regardless, we're expecting to see you having got planning permission or seeking approvals throughout this project rather than waiting until you've got approval for phase 2 and then asking if you can do it, because then we're not going to meet the project funding deadlines and the demonstration stage is going to be a lot harder then. And again, if you're successful in phase 1, you can add and remove partners before you get to phase 2. So the overarching aim of this competition is to deliver creative new design and technology for low-cost, scalable charging solutions. So not just something that works for that specific area, but something that could be taken up by anyone, depending on whether it suits there, and ensure that it's not too expensive for local authorities to pick up and maintain going forwards. And then other aims are to encourage electric vehicle take-up in the area, improve air quality, and provide a good experience for the end users, both private users and public users that might be working for the council or people in that area. So these next few slides are all taken from the scope document, which are online. But just the kind of general things that we're looking to see for your project to be in scope. So solutions must be convenient to the users and designed appropriately for the proposed location. So that could range from on-street charging infrastructure through to local charging hubs. Your proposal must demonstrate commercially feasible business models. So we're not looking for something that might be able to charge all the cars rapidly, install a load of rapid chargers, but is never going to be able to be scaled up and a lot of people take up because it's just too expensive. We're looking for things that work realistically. We're looking to see your projects include attention to or a study of social and behavioural aspects. So who uses it, why they're using it, when and what they're using it for. and looking to have projects that are inclusive to the users in the location, sensitive to issues around accessibility again, avoid monopolising existing parking infrastructure, so we don't want you to take up 2 whole streets, take away the parking for all the cars and just make it EV, because then you're going to cause some tension within the community, because parking can be quite an emotive subject. And again, give consideration as to whether the location's appropriate. Is it a conservation area? Are you trying to do this on a floodplain, et cetera, et cetera? So these are all things that are not, you don't have to have in your project, but we're encouraging projects that have things within this list. So looking at things that can be used in different streets and locations, providing infrastructure that's well designed and makes sufficient use of the street space, looking to see how it could be integrated in a nicer looking way, or things that benefit not just people that are charging. Favour interoperability with charging providers, that's quite important. Looking at making sure projects are resilient and future-proof, so are not going to be needed to be all ripped out and replaced very quickly. Considering potential wider uses, such as traffic movements or crime prevention. So could the infrastructure that you're implementing also analyse the traffic that's moving past? Also analyse whether there's a lot of movement in the area that's unusual. Providing data that maybe could be useful to local authorities or other bodies in the area that could be another revenue stream will make it more attractive. Minimise road disruption. We don't really want you to spend half the demonstration phase ripping up roads and implementing infrastructure. Obviously, there's going to have to be a little bit of disruption, but not mass disruption, please. Thinking about local energy assets. So is there something that could be done within your project around energy storage, grid balancing, smart charging? How can you integrate with the energy system that's there? And considering multiple use cases. So again, could it be used for traffic analysis? Could it be used as street furniture, a bench, or advertising, things like that? Just thinking about what else could it be useful when not just charging cars. Things that we won't fund. If your project is completely focused on putting hardware on board vehicles, we're not looking to fund projects that have that as their primary focus. And whilst we will fund technological design and application, we're not looking for fundamental technology development, so we're not looking for kind of brand new prototyping and developing that in the demonstration phase. Home charge point sharing, we're not looking to support projects that are using people's personal charge points and Airbnb-ing them out. Replications of solutions already trialed and tested. This funding isn't for mass implementation of things that have already been proven. There's already funding to do that kind of implementation for local authorities, so here we're looking to do something a bit different. And finally, solutions that take away from pedestrian space or cause problems for those with accessibility issues. So if your project is going to remove half the pavement, not so keen on projects that do that. And again, we don't have the slide for it on this one, but with this competition as well, there's going to be data collection for this one too. A lot of similar things around charging, how long people use it for, and then qualitative areas as well. But again, as Marco said, if you have questions about that part, then we can answer those. Scope questions now.
You want me to put the data collection slide? I'll see if they on the computer.
We could do. It's going to go up on the screen.
Here. Okay, I'll put yours in.
Because it's smaller.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. So, are there any questions for Marco and Zoe on the scope? Ladies first, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Céline Cluzel from Element Energy. I just want to clarify, you say you want something, the proposal demonstrates that the solution is commercially feasible with a proper business model, but at the same time it has to have never been trial or tested. So that demonstration of the commercial model will be based on projections, not yet a proven business model. So you recognize that. So for me, one of the output of feasibility study is a strengthened business model and the demonstration will work, but it cannot be completely done at proposal stage. Would you agree?
Yeah, so we're expecting to see you kind of explain how it's going to be commercially feasible, especially in the feasibility study stage, and put forward a good case as to how you see it being commercially feasible. Yeah, we're not expecting you to have complete projections and explanations up front.
So
And
if I can add to that, the idea behind the feasibility studies is to give, the idea behind the feasibility studies is to give local authorities particularly, but not only, the confidence to invest in the longer term. So these are not deployment projects. We're not looking to deploy a massive infrastructure. There's other funding for that, as Doi mentioned. But we're looking to test new solutions that local authorities or private landowner can have confidence in investing after the projects, the trials are over. We're not demanding hardcore analysis with hard numbers already proven and tested, but at least an idea that if something basically doesn't make the case, not even on paper, that probably local authorities or private landowner won't be willing to invest on that. And that's the whole scope about being commercially feasible.
And would you say that phase one could be completely desk-based, or will you see that there will be some hardware testing involved in phase one already?
The basic idea behind feasibility studies is, to be honest, is desk-based. The idea behind it is to try to embed the analysis of the technology with the planning and the procurement exercises of the and commercial modeling that basically can make sense for the potential installer in the longer run of that technology. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis Nabarusian from Ricardo. I think you mentioned that to go from phase one to phase two will be the winners of phase one that will move on to phase two. How will those be judged? How do you expect to actually select successful projects at the end of phase one?
There will be another application process for phase two. So opening in February?
Yes.
Yeah, before the project's end, it'll open in February as another competition, but it'll be closed to those in phase one. So similar application process to normal Innovate UK calls, but also taking into account the business case from phase one.
Okay, so it will be judged on the strength of the proposal as opposed to the feasibility study itself.
It's the same kind of procedure and assessment process that you have with normal competition. So you will have an assessment process for the feasibility studies, and then a new competition strand the phase two competition strand will open, and there will be a standard assessor assessing the application.
Okay, thank you.
So when competitions go through the competition process later on, it will be a similar thing for phase two as well.
Yeah, and just to echo what Marco said, so the questions will be the same between phase one and phase two, but obviously to inform your responses at phase two, you'll be using the content from your feasibility study to answer the questions that we're asking for the phase two section. But like Zoe said, that will be explained later on.
Thank you very much. Keith Budden from Senex. Regarding the wireless charging, you mentioned that the eligible vehicles would be taxis and commercial vehicles. Does that include both private hire and hackney carriages in terms of how they're registered in terms of local authority use? And does that include publicly owned vehicles? Would you classify those as commercial, for example, police cars or vans or vehicles operated by a local authority?
So private hire, definitely. The idea behind it, though, is we do include, the part of the scope is including service vehicles. I would say that if they stick to the scope of the competition, yes. The idea is basically to increase the take-up of vehicles among commercial users. So if wireless charging is a way in which, I don't know, an ambulance can basically can be converted to EV, yes, they will be considered in scope. If it's basically just a way, the Great London Authority wants to convert their already and has made already plans for converting all their police cars to EV, and already have the infrastructure, and the wireless is just an addendum, I would say probably not so much. The point is mirroring the scope and the intention behind the scope that is favoring the take-up of vehicles from take-up to EV of categories that right now are not looking at EV at all.
But if that vehicle could then do different operational duties because of wireless charging, maybe that would encourage more take-up of police vehicles across the country, perhaps.
I would say if you have a specific case in mind, come and talk to us afterwards.
Yes, Chuck.
Hi, I had two questions. The first one is, do I understand correctly that the phase one projects have to basically be a fully worked through study on your proposed phase two project? You can't just pick, for example, some particular aspect of the general problem, some of the problems that have been highlighted, and just work on that one with a view to joining some consortium in a phase two project. That's the first question. Second question is, are you defining what you call a public space for the second competition somewhere?
I didn't get the second question though, sorry.
Sorry. The second question is, which for the second, question two, second competition, are you defining what you're calling a public space?
Okay. I'll take.
Because it's not obvious to me what it is and what it isn't.
I'll take the first one. Basically, you're right, in feasibility studies, we're looking at proving the concept of the whole technology. So if you focus on some specific, since the consortium alteration are possible, you might want to, I don't know, focus on specific things in the first phase and join a consortium that is doing the demonstrator. But in general, as general direction, we are looking at something that justifies the investment in the infrastructure or doing the demo for that infrastructure in that specific location or in similar location. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope so. Do you want to take the second one?
Yeah. So when we're talking about public spaces, there we're really meaning charging infrastructure that anyone can use. So we're not looking for a big private area of land to be taken up and redeveloped for charging, if that makes sense.
Can I give you an example? A privately owned car park owned by SCP. Is that public space? Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Just to give you a concrete example, a car park owned by NCP or any other car parking provider, or a station car park owned by a particular company, is that public space or private?
The way we define that in the scope is publicly accessible space. Again, let's not forget what the scope, the intention behind the aim of the competition is, which is trying to cater for residents that don't have off-street parking. So if you have specific example of car park that cater to that, come and talk to us afterwards. We will include, for example, charging hubs. We will, of course, it's included on-street, widespread on-street infrastructure on public-owned roads. If you have a specific example of car park or specific idea in mind, come and talk to us afterwards. The thing that I want to stress is that the point is trying to stick to the aim behind the competition, which is try to drive EV take-up among people that don't have off-street parking. So if you have for example, if you have an NCP car park that uses this funding to use rapid charging and basically to increase their ticket because they had a new service, it's probably not what we are looking for because it doesn't solve an issue that the competition is aimed to.
So is it fair to say what you're after is the sorts of places where people who don't have a drive leave their cars overnight?
Yeah, that sums it all. Thanks.
One here.
You are? Yeah.
Just a quick question on the wireless competition. So we said it was not to target private users. I just wanted to understand a bit of the rationale behind that. And then related, I suppose, is there scope for any projects to bid into both competitions or projects that interact in both areas?
So the idea behind excluding private users is, well, different reasons. There are already, as we've seen, some manufacturers that are coming with wireless chargers. That is basically an optional at the moment. You can retrofit some cars, but the idea is basically that we want to drive, again, take up from commercial users. And wireless is not an option because it's something that is fancy or cool to do, but it's just a way to eliminate a barrier for them, which is having to stop and interrupt their work and try to embed the charging into their working cycles. So that's the basic idea. In terms of bridging the two competitions, I would say if you have any specific idea, come and talk to us afterwards. You can bid in two different competitions. In both of them. I would say if your project covers both of them, try to split it across the two. Don't do a single project. Probably one thing that we didn't mention explicitly, but if you want to, for example, do wireless for eliminate the street clutter, it can be part of the on-street charging competition. So probably that goes in your direction.
Yeah. Louise Clancy, London Councils. I have a question in relation to the public charging competition. Do you have any thoughts or preferences in terms of scale, like whether you're looking at the technology being deployed in one street or 20 streets of different types of streets? Have you had any thoughts with regards to that?
So we're not putting a limit on size of trial, but we would like to see, as you say, kind of multiple streets or enough, as much as possible within the constraints of this funding time scale and amounts. So if that works for you and you can do 20 streets, then that would be a great example. But yeah, the timing constraints of this call, we understand that that's possibly not going to happen. But yeah, I would say like to see as much as possible, not extremely small scale, because we want you to demonstrate that it is scalable and viable in the area.
If I might add to that, basically one of the key points is trying to evaluate how the infrastructure is used. If you have only over a street where you have like hundreds of houses, you have only 2 charging spots, probably that's not going to be enough to evaluate how actually people react to it and how people use it. One thing that we did is valid for 2 competitions. We put some funding limits. If you have a project that goes beyond the funding limits or outside that window that we put, please contact us before putting your application.
Yeah, just to add to that, so within your application, whatever scale you choose to do your project at, you need to tell us clearly why that's the right scale for you to do what you're trying to achieve. And as Zoe says and Marco says, that's all dependent on making sure that you can demonstrate what you're trying to achieve from the project. So it depends on the particular project that you have in mind.
Douglas Watson from City EV. Just following on from that point, could you explain a little bit more about the intervention rates and whether there are any restrictions on funding some of the local authorities?
So it's probably best to wait for competitions to explain all of the funding rates later, because they will go through that in more detail. Local authorities are
100%.
100%. It's 100% normally local authorities. But again, competition team will explain all the eligibility. It's not over yet, so please don't go away after this. But basically, they will explain all the process of application, all the funding rules and the limits and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Hi, just for absolute clarity, in the second competition, you stated that you didn't want any replication. We have some existing in-lamppost charging infrastructure in our locality. You don't want that to be scaled up. You don't want to see something that's already been done replicated or expanded, right?
Yeah, I'd say for lamppost charging, for example, that's potentially already, there's been trials, right? And it's been shown that that's worked to a certain extent. I don't think we'd look to fund just implementing that on a slightly larger scale. We want to see some differences around that, but we can...
So new technology utilising the same piece of street infrastructure would be considered, but just not the same charging piece, if you like.
If I can add to that, is don't look at innovation, this is just a general suggestion, don't look at innovation as specifically a technology problem. In this space, a lot of innovation is done in terms of customer proposition, business model, the way to integrate a piece of technology already existing into a cityscape or a roadscape. So innovation is not necessarily about technology. What we don't want to see, just to be clear, what we don't want to see is the large-scale deployment of things that have already been tested. We want to see that innovation. We want to see innovative projects. We don't want to see replication or simply deployment at scale.
Okay, so again, just to follow that up, you'd be interested in seeing a city platform, for example, that unified a number of different charge point network operators under one payment card, or into MAS, for example?
I think if you have a specific idea, again, talk to us afterwards. I think that can potentially be in scope if it solves the original aim of the competition. If that becomes just a platform to avoid, how should I say, to unifying payment, but doesn't solve the problem, the original problem that is try to address the residents that don't have off-street parking and won't transfer to EV because they cannot charge at home. So essentially, just to say, if that platform only covers, for example, the existing infrastructure without adding anything to people that at the moment they don't have any infrastructure where to charge their car, probably is not in scope. It depends on how closely it matches the original aim behind the competition. Any other question? Oh.
Yeah, we'll move.
Thanks. Did I hear you say that you wouldn't support product development?
That's
in the sorry, the young lady's.
The second one.
Yeah.
Not that we wouldn't support product development, but that we're not looking for extremely early stage kind of prototyping level of development, if that makes sense. Brand new technology that's going to, half the demonstration phase is going to be on developing that technology.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think Zoe's comment was around specifically on-vehicle technology development, and we have a different competition running in September with OLEV that's focused on on-vehicle technology development, which might be more suitable.
So I was thinking, if you've got a product which is specifically designed to meet this requirement, and it's perhaps not been used before, that's very early product development. So as part of the competition, it'd be great if you could define, perhaps in technology readiness type parlance, you know, what your expectations are.
Can I just add to that? When Joe was saying no fundamental technology development, just to make an example, if you're going to develop the next DC-DC and the next converter in silicon carbide on purpose for this competition, that's not what we are looking for. But if you have already this new converter and you want to integrate in a different packaging because it makes sense to have this new packaging to integrate into the cityscape, that's in scope. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, I'd worth a chat afterwards, actually.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I think a lot of that is around the fact that we do want demonstration in phase 2. So we want products to be deployed and working during the demonstration. So not, so if it's TRL1 and not ready to go out into the street to charge vehicles, then that's not in scope.
Yeah, I was just thinking about rapid prototyping and these sorts of things. So you know, you can get to the market quite quickly, but you start your early development very, very early. Okay, we'll have a chat.
Thank you. I'm John Hewitt, Hewitt Studios. Zoe, you spoke of a vision with many dimensions to it, which we would wholly endorse. When it comes down to delivery, is it your intention that these projects will be delivered through normal public sector procurement routes, where in our experience the whole show can be slowed down, and the way in which you have talked about the challenge is across the different silos. When it comes down to procurement, is there a risk that procurement will leave us in the silo of transportation? And the spirit of partnering with local authorities that you've set out becomes rather difficult to deliver? Or is there a special purpose vehicle for delivery you have in mind, which shares the level of innovation which the rest of the initiative seems to carry?
Mm-hmm. It would be great if we had a special purpose vehicle for public procurement, but that's why it's in 2 phases, and we're giving a chance for feasibility studies and working with local authorities to think about what procurement would be possible and what that might look like further down the road. I think from a lot of the projects that we've done in the urban sector have had local authorities involved, and a lot of that up front initially I think is going to be a lot of learning about how local authorities can work with innovative business and vice versa. So we're hoping in that feasibility study to kind of think about some of those procurement routes and bottom out what options might be possible, whether it is public procurement or private initially, with support from local authorities. So we're expecting to see a lot of that in the first phase, but no, we don't have a special route to procurement, and we are aware that that may cause
I think it's potentially a silent killer, and it's a really important component of what you're setting out to achieve.
Yeah.
On that specific case, that surfaced also in the workshop. It really depends, from my understanding, but I'll ask for support from local authorities in this. But my understanding was that it really depends on what you're going to do with infrastructure. So some local authorities have particular provisioning if you're using infrastructure for a demonstration rather than as a deployment of the infrastructure, like longer term. So there are some ways around that. What we are trying to see, the involvement of, we see the involvement of local authorities as key, not only to support with these queries about procurement and how to go around that, but also to have a buy-in in these technologies, support their planning. So it's a little bit more than simply having somebody that has the land where to store the chargers.
Yeah, and I think we're hoping that, although hope is that these kind of projects and ones that we've done in the past, having local authorities involved in the bid from the start allows you to kind of sell the benefits of breaking down those silos and funding barriers within that, and start thinking about how departments might procure together and look at those options.
I think it's a really important consideration, and we would encourage that, speaking on behalf of SMEs in the private sector who wish to work in partnership with the public sector, but find it difficult to do so with a silo-based procurement route that local authorities are often constrained by.
Are there any more questions?
Hi Zoe, James Fleming, Eat to Green Technologies. I've just got a quick question. I just wanted a little bit more clarity on what you was talking about, existing infrastructure with bollards and lampposts. We've got a product that's really, really small, and the plan is to put it in lampposts, bollards, parking meters, that kind of thing. Are you saying that that's actually out of scope? Because that's kind of the whole point that we're here today. So. No,
not necessarily. I think as we were saying earlier, what we don't want to fund are things that are out and ready to be purchased now and could be uptaken using funding that's already available from OLEV for infrastructure of charging, that kind of area. So if you are explaining in your application what's novel about it, how it's different, and it's not just putting in infrastructure that already exists and has been proven.
From what I've seen, the sort of lamppost and bollard charging points have got quite a lot of the hardware on the outside, where what we've got is where the hardware is actually inside the lamppost. It's just the only thing that will be visible is the charging cable and a pay pad, a touch point, contactless card point. So I just wanted to make sure that was in scope before we sort of went through the application.
Yeah, I think so. We can talk later about your specific project.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, James. Any more questions? Oh.
Hi, Paul Richardson from Brighton and Hove City Council. If anybody wants to talk to local authorities, we're willing to take part in these developments.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome to come for the pitching session afterwards, so you might get a little bit more networking after that.
Any further questions? Any Ryan from the webcast? No? Okay. Just say a couple of words. Innovate UK and Knowledge Transfer Network are here to help you in this in a number of ways. On the Innovate UK website, if you go in, there is the support desk, which Zoe and Mark haven't mentioned. I assume the applications team will put the address up for that.
Yeah, that's just support@innovateuk.gov.uk.
Yeah. That's there if you've any questions about the scope and about whether your application will be okay in scope. As far as the Knowledge Transfer Network is concerned, we can help you, and it's great to hear that the local authority is willing to be in some of these applications, proposals. We're there if you want help building consortia. We can probably put you in touch with relevant people wherever they are in the supply chain. And one of the other things that the Knowledge Transfer Network does is in looking at your proposals for Innovate UK competitions, we will look through it. We won't look at it in terms of the technology or whether it's in scope, and we certainly won't look at it if you use a professional bid writer that you pay them, but we will look at it and sense check it and make sure that you've answered the questions. So we are there to help you as much as you can in building consortia and putting in a good proposal.
I think on that as well, if you want, obviously we're happy to talk to you about your specific projects and whether or not we think they're in scope, but if you do want kind of documented written evidence of your questions and what we've said in response, then do go through the support desk and it will get channeled through to us just for a more formal written answer. And also KTN won't look at your proposals if you send them the day before the deadline.
That is true. Thanks very much indeed. We would like a couple of days' notice to look through the proposals.
If I can,
okay.
Sorry, Ian, can I just make a comment? Just because of our... keep in mind that basically the window in which the competition is open is relatively short. I just wanted to stress that unfortunately we are not able to either prolong that window or the funding. So unfortunately the dates are pretty much airtight, I would say. So keep that in mind because we cannot allow any slippage. Just as a warning before the putting in application. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Break. Refreshments are outside. What time is it now? About 20 past? Yeah, okay.
I'm Philip Haddow. I'm one of the portfolio managers for these competitions. And with me today is Joe Lyford, who is the portfolio manager for the other competition. And today we're going to be running through the operational process and the competition application form. So the agenda this morning, first I'm going to run through the eligibility criteria for these competitions and the application process, including the project details and the application questions. I'll then hand over to Joe, who will cover the application finances, submitting your application, the assessment process, a little bit on project setup for if you're a successful applicant, and then at the end we'll have time for a Q&A for any questions you may have. So first off, the eligibility criteria. So as you know, there's two different competitions. Each competition has two different phases. So whilst a lot of it has criteria in common, I'll be going through each phase of each competition. So for the electric vehicle charging for public spaces, for this phase 1 competition, feasibility studies. So first off, what both competitions have in common is that the lead must be a UK-based business, it must be collaborative, you must aim to carry out your project in the UK and exploit the results from or in the UK. For this phase 1 feasibility study, your project cost can be between £75,000 and £120,000. It can be up to 3 months in length. Your research participation limit is 30%, so that's how much of the project costs can be incurred by research organisations, but I'll touch more on that later. And projects must start by January 1st, 2019 and end by the end of March 2019. The second phase for this competition, again, the basic project eligibility is the same. However, the project costs for this is between £5 and £10 million, project length of up to 18 months, and these projects must start by September 2019 and end by the end of February 2021. For the wireless charging competition, for phase 1, the eligibility criteria are the same as for the other competition. So that's project costs of £75,000 to £120,000. And again, projects must start by January 1st and end by the end of March 2019. Phase 2 is where the two competitions diverge from one another. So for this competition, the big difference is that for phase 2, your project cost can be between £3 million and £9 million. Aside from that, all the other criteria are the same. Projects must start by September 2019 and must end by the end of February 2021. So the types of organisations we fund. So as I covered in the eligibility criteria, the lead partner of this competition can be a UK business of any size. Also able to apply for funding as partners are research organisations, so this includes universities, non-profit distributing research and technology organisations, and the other organisations listed on the slide. You can also be public sector organisations and charities doing research activity. And as we said before, to receive funding from us, you must be based in the UK. So as part of our participation, we use state aid, which dictates the rules that we need to follow. As part of this, at least 70% of your total eligible costs must be incurred by a business. If an academic or an RTO is in your team, the maximum level of project costs is 30%. If there is more than one academic, this 30% will be split between them. So for example, a business will take 70, and then one academic will take 20, another academic will take 10. Research organisations are not able to lead in this competition, but they may partner in as many applications as they wish. So next, just a quick note on collaboration. So for us to see it as a viable collaboration, you must have at least 2 organisations claiming grant within the application. This includes the lead organisation, and it must be a consortium made up of both business and research, or just business, if that's what you want to do. And there must be evidence of a genuine collaboration in your application. You'll need to explain how all parties will contribute to the project and benefit from this collaboration. Just to touch on some of the other rules for getting funding, if you have an outstanding claim and independent accountant report on any current live Innovate UK project, you will not be eligible to apply for grant funding in this competition as a lead or as a partner organisation. And if you applied to a previous competition as the lead or the sole company and were awarded funding by Innovate UK, but you did not make a substantial effort to exploit that award, we will not grant you any more funding. So now arguably the most important slide in today's presentation, the key dates. So the competition opened yesterday on the 9th, and we have 2 briefing events. We've got here today in London, and we've got one on Thursday in Manchester. The submission deadline is very important. That's the 29th of August 2018. And it's important to note that the submission deadline is 12 noon on the dot. IFS will automatically close, and so at 12:01, applications will not be able to be submitted. We strongly recommend that you submit your application as early as possible, as website traffic will be high on deadline day. And please contact our customer support ahead of the competition closing if you experience any technical difficulties, so that we have good time in order to help you submit your application. The other dates here are that we will let applicants know on the 28th of September, and then, as I've previously stated, phase 1 applications need to have started by the 1st of January. The phase 2 application process will then open on the 4th of February and close on the 3rd of April 2019, just to give you an idea of kind of the timescales we're working to in this competition. So now I'm going to go through the Innovation Funding Service and how to use it to apply if you've not used this new service before. So, as this map shows, our users are all over the world, and IFS helps them to collaborate with their project partners wherever they are. This map shows the location of IFS users for the period of July 2017 to May 2018. As you would expect, the majority are in the UK, but following this, there are a large number of users in Germany, the USA, Colombia, China, and India. So when you go onto the IFS website, you'll need to search for these competitions. There is a keyword search, which you can use, and then you click the title and it opens the competition. And when you click on the competition, you'll be able to see a tabbed view of the eligibility criteria, the scope, the key dates, and information on how to apply. When you're happy, you can click on the bright green Start New Application button to begin. To apply for a competition, the lead applicant will need to create an account. If you've applied for previous competitions on IFS, you can simply sign into your account and do your application through that. You can use Companies House lookup to search your organisation to save you having to type in the name and the details. If you are not on Companies House, you can manually enter this information. If you are a research organisation or an academic, we advise that you manually enter your information so that you're not listed as a business, because this will affect how much grant you can claim. Once you have logged in, you'll get this view. From here, you can set up your consortium and your team members. The team members are people from your organisation who will be working on the application with you. Your collaborators are the partner organisations who you'll be working with on your application. You can invite people by entering their name and their email address. IFS will then invite them via email to create an account and join in on your application. You'll be able to assign questions to these people to have them help with your application, as seen on the next slide here. So here we've got, when completing your application, you can assign questions to other people in your organisation or a partner organisation to complete or edit the answer. They can then assign the question to someone else to complete or edit, or they can mark it as complete via the blue hyperlink at the bottom. You can still edit your answers after marking them as complete. There are some key features in IFS in that you can spell check and format your answers. You're able to view your word count limit, and you're able to see the online guidance built into the web page. So the application form itself is as on screen, and it's split into the 3 sections of project details, application questions, and then your finances. Project details are not marked, but they're for setting the scene. Application questions are the marked part, and then the finances, an overview of these will be taken into consideration when the assessors look at your application. So first off, project details. So application details is the title, the timescales, the research category, and the innovation area. Please make sure your research category is correct, as this is used to calculate your grant value. For these phase 1 competitions, these are all feasibility studies, so hopefully that should be all right. For project summary, you're highlighting the need or challenge, the approach and innovation, and the outcomes. This is key to setting the scene for the assessors when they come to mark your application, and it gives them an overview of your vision. The public description is similar, but this is tied into the fact that as a public organisation, we have to publish everyone who we give funding to. So as part of this, make sure you don't put any confidential information into your public summary, as it will be available for anyone to look up and see. And then the scope is important because it's important because you need to emphasise how your project fits into the scope of the competition and why that makes it eligible for funding. So I'll now go through the questions for phase 1 of this competition. Whilst the questions for phase 2 are likely to be similar, these haven't been finalised yet, so please just take this as the phase 1 competition questions. Anyone who's applied to us before might be familiar with these questions. These are our 10 standard sector competition questions. The full guidance for these are available online, so I'm just going to give an overview of these for you today. Questions 2, 3, 7 and 8 allow appendices of up to 1 megabyte in size, and I'll explain as to what you're allowed in these questions as we go through. So question 1 is need or challenge. So that is, what is the business need, technological challenge or market opportunity driving your innovation, i.e. what is the main motivation for your project? Question 2 is, what approach will you take and where will the focus of the innovation be? So that's your approach, your innovation, how you address the need, challenge or opportunity identified. For this question, you may upload an appendix in PDF format, up to 2 pages of A4, of graphics and diagrams to demonstrate your innovation of your technology, product or service. At this point, I'll emphasize that the appendices must be legible at 100% zoom for the assessors, so you can't just make the text smaller in order to fit more on, because they'll have to treat it as though they can't read it. Question 3 is team and resources, i.e. who is in the project team and what are their roles. So that's describing the roles, skills and relevant experience of all members of the project team. For this question, you may upload an appendix, again, PDF format, max 1 megabyte, 4 sides of A4, to describe the skills and experience of the main people who will be working on the project. Question 4 is market awareness. What does the market you're targeting look like? What is the market, either domestic or international, that you will be targeting in your application? And are there any other potential markets you could see it reaching into? Question 5 is outcomes and route to market. So how do you propose to grow your business and increase your productivity into the long term as a result of this project? So what is your current position in the market and where do you aim to end up? And other details surrounding that. Question 6 is on wider impacts. So what impact might this project have outside of the direct project team? So what are the economic benefits from the project outside of the project itself? Question 7 is project management. How will you manage the project effectively? As a part of this, you upload a project plan or Gantt chart, maximum of 2 sides of A4 as a PDF, as an appendix to support this answer. Question 8 is on risks. What are the main risks for the project? So it's usually on this question that we emphasize that innovation projects are inherently risky. We expect this, that's what we're here to fund. If there's no risk involved, then there'd be no point us running these competitions. So as part of this, you may upload a risk register of up to 2 sides of A4 to support this answer as a PDF. Question 9 is additionality. So describe the impact that an injection of public funding would have on this project. Would it still be able to go ahead without public funding? What would the impact be? And as a result, why is public funding vital to this project? And the final question, question 10, is costs and value for money. How much will the project cost and how does it represent value for money for the team and for the taxpayer? So this is justifying your total project cost, justifying how much grant you're getting, and connecting these costs to the work that you're planning to undertake. I'll now hand over to my colleague Joe Lyford, who will take you through the application finances and the rest of today's presentation.
Thank you, Philip. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Lyford. I'm a portfolio manager at Innovate UK as part of our competitions team. So I'll be managing these competitions up to the point that successful applicants actually begin their projects. So I'm going to talk to you about three things today. Firstly, I'll talk to you about the funding rules that we have in place for these competitions. I will then talk to you about how to actually submit your application to us using our innovation funding service. And finally, I will talk to you about what will happen should you be successful in applying for this competition. So, the finance section for industry partners within IFS is divided into three areas, as you can see on the screen, and each organisation must complete each of these areas individually before an application can be submitted to us. The three areas are your project costs, your organisation, and your funding, and I will take you through each of these now. The first area is your project costs, and for those of you who have applied to us previously, you will recognise the eligible cost categories on the screen. You will need to enter the detail behind any of these categories that you require for your project, and the service will calculate the total values for you. So I will touch briefly on what is and what is not eligible as we go through each of these cost categories. However, full guidance on these is actually available to you online. So please refer to that, and the presentation today won't be completely exhaustive. Firstly, we have labour costs. So here you can enter the details for anyone who is to work directly on your project. IFS allows you to enter their project role, their gross annual salary, and the number of days in which they are to spend working directly on the project itself. And it will then automatically calculate a subsequent daily rate and total cost for you. All staff and labour costs must be paid as per PAYE, and you should include non-discretionary items only. Discretionary items such as dividends or performance-related pay, for example, are ineligible and cannot be included. For overhead costs, you have three options available to you. If you do not wish to include any overhead costs whatsoever, then that's fine. You can simply select the no overhead costs option, and it will just produce a naught value. The second option is for you to select the 20% of labour cost option, which will produce a value automatically based on your labour costs. Or finally, you can choose to actually calculate your own overhead costs for you. And if you do choose to calculate your own overhead costs, then the calculate overhead cost section is split into two sections, both indirect and direct overhead costs. So we class firstly indirect or administration overhead costs as those costs associated with back office functions such as HR or finance, for example, who will not be playing a direct role on your project, but we will be playing some form of supporting role. And these costs must be both additional and directly attributable to the project itself. Secondly, then we have direct overheads, and these are costs associated with staff who are working directly on the project. So in other words, those that you've included within your labour costs. And are items such as laptops and utilities, for example, which again must be directly attributable to the project itself. So the Innovation Funding Service allows you to download and upload the calculation spreadsheet, and to reiterate, full guidance on overhead costs is available to you during the application process online. For material costs, you can simply enter the items, volumes, and the unit costs for any materials that are to be used entirely on your project, and the subsequent totals will be calculated for you. We would expect any residual values for any items to be removed when you enter the cost per item, so that all costs are completely project specific. For capital usage, you can include a description of any assets that are required to deliver your project, state whether they are new or existing, state the depreciation period to be used on that asset, which should be in line with your organisation's depreciation policy. You can state the value of the asset at the start of the project, the residual value at the end, and finally the degree of utilisation of that asset to deliver your project. IFS will then automatically calculate the usage cost based on these details, such as in the example that you can see on the screen. For subcontract costs, you can include the costs of work which cannot reasonably be carried out within your organisation. If the work is to be carried out abroad, then please do include a detailed explanation as to why a UK alternative has not been selected to deliver the work. And in addition, if the work is to be carried out by a linked entity, such as a parent company, for example, then please do state that the work will be carried out entirely at cost, with no profit element incorporated within the figure that you state. For travel and subsistence, you can include the cost of any journeys which are really necessary to deliver your project. Make sure that the purpose is always explained, is always justified, and note that sales and marketing and exploitation activity is not eligible and should not be included. And the very final cost category that we have is other costs, which is simply to be used for items that do not fit into the previous categories, such as, for example, training or patent filing costs. So please do ensure across all of your cost categories that there is no double counting, and within this section you can simply enter any such items in the box provided. So once you're happy that all of your project costs have been added to the system, you will then be given the opportunity to review one final time before you submit to us. And you will also need to confirm that the costs that you have entered into the system are eligible as far as our project cost guidance is concerned, and then you can simply mark the section as complete. So the next area of the finance section is your organisation, as highlighted on the screen. In this section, you need to enter details relating to your organisation specifically, such as its size, which will then determine the level of grant that you are eligible to receive from us for your project. And if you are a newly incorporated organisation and you don't have any account history, then you can simply enter 0 values for the financial categories like you can see on the screen. And the very final area of the finance section for industry partners is your funding. Now, the level of grant that you can receive from us depends on 2 factors, really. It depends firstly on the type of organisation that you are, and secondly, it depends on the type of research that your project represents, and the Innovation Funding Service will calculate your grant based on these criteria. So these are the funding rules that we have in place for these competitions. So businesses are clearly outlined on the slide. If you are a micro or small, you can receive 70% grant against your eligible project costs. Medium receive 60% and large receive 50%. For research organisations, universities can claim 100% funding, which is 80% of the full economic cost. Other research organisations can also claim 100%, but they must be non-profit distributing and they must clearly disseminate their project results. Public sector organisations or charities can also claim 100% grant funding, but again, they must be performing research and again, they must clearly disseminate their results. So the example on the screen shows the maximum level of grant entitled to the applicant is 70% based on the details that they have provided in the service. You also need to state whether you have any other public funding in place for your projects, as this will obviously reduce the level of grant that you are entitled to receive from us. And you must also state here that you agree to our terms and conditions that we have in place for the competitions. These were actually previously outlined in a conditional offer letter, which we no longer use for competitions that we run through the Innovation Funding Service. So please do tell us if you have received any other public funding related to this project in particular. You do need to declare this. If you have received funding for previous work that has led to this project, then you don't need to state that. You don't need to tell us anything about that. But any funding that you have received, any public funding that you've received already for your project, will have to be taken off your grant allowance to comply with the grant intervention rates. Before submitting your application, you are actually able to view the financial overview of the project. So this page states that the funding rules for the competition, including the eligible total project costs and the project duration. Please do check that your figures are in line with the funding rules that we've mentioned in this presentation. And remember that your total project costs must be within the published eligible cost parameters and not anything to do with the funding source. So please do not confuse the two. Please don't confuse the difference between project costs and project grant. If any organisation wishes to participate in a project but not claim any grant, then that's fine. They will need to select the not requesting funding option within IFS, but still complete the project cost section, as obviously their project costs will still contribute towards things such as the level of research proportion that we have in place for this competition. They will not be named in a grant offer letter should you be successful in applying for this competition, but they will still need to be named in your collaboration agreement, because whilst they will not have a legal relationship with Innovate UK, they will still have a legal relationship with the rest of the participants in your project. So I'm going to talk very briefly now about the finances for academic partners, which are handled slightly differently and are processed through the JES system. So this system is already familiar with academics and universities. It's actually owned by the research councils rather than us, and it validates the costs for us to produce the 80% full economic cost figure that we then use going forward in your project. Academic partners will need to complete the Your Project Cost section within IFS, and this must be completed for them to be included as a collaborator within your project. This next slide just shows you which fields will need to be completed for academic partners, which must also be identical to the with council status PDF JES document that you will also need to upload to IFS as part of your application. And as I mentioned, given that the JES system is not owned by us, but it's owned by the research councils, any queries relating to university costs are best directed to the JES help desk, whose contact details are on the screen. And in terms of actually submitting your application to us, the next slide shows you the project cost summary for a project with all of the participants included. This is the level of detail that assessors and other consortium members will be able to see of your finances. The detail behind these actual cost categories can only be seen by individual organisations, so you can only see your own, because obviously some of the information is sensitive. In terms of actually validating project costs, the Innovation Funding Service will check that all partners have marked their finances as complete and that the research proportion of project costs is no greater than 30%. And it will actually flag to you if there are any issues to address before you can then submit to us. You will then have the option to review any aspects of your application before you actually finally submit it to us. And we recommend that you leave plenty of time to finalise your application. As Philip mentioned earlier, the deadline that we have in place is completely absolute, and there are no exceptions to that. And when you're actually ready to submit your application, you can simply click on the green icon, and you'll be taken to this confirmation page, which also outlines the next steps in the process. So I don't know how clear you can actually see this slide from where you are. Essentially, this table shows the number of applicants submitting their proposals each hour leading up to the noon deadline for a previous competition that we've run. So as you can see, the majority of applicants do leave it into the final minutes to submit their application to us. We strongly recommend, therefore, that submitting your application perhaps a little bit earlier than this. Do leave plenty of time to make sure everything is absolutely fine, to avoid any last-minute technical issues, because obviously if it's 5 minutes before the deadline and you do have any issues, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to get in contact with us, and we can then help you to fix any issues before the noon deadline. So please do bear that in mind when working on your application. Once you have submitted, you can then return to your dashboard page within IFS, which shows you the status of any applications that you have indeed made or started with us. And I'm now going to move on to the assessment process for the competition very briefly. So all applications that are submitted will be assessed by 5 independent assessors from both industrial and academic backgrounds, which will then collate to produce a total average score per proposal. Some key things that assessors want from applications include clarity with the appropriate amount of information and detail. So they don't want to be completely bombarded and overloaded with detail that might not necessarily be completely relevant. But at the same time, they don't want to have to make guesses and assumptions as to what you're trying to do or what you're trying to say within your application. So it's important to find the right balance between those two. Make sure that your responses are always justified and quantified when necessary, and a viable opportunity for growth must be clearly presented throughout your application, which therefore necessitates an injection of public funding. And once applications have been assessed and scored, feedback will be made available to you within the Innovation Funding Service, and the lead applicant will be notified when this is available. This will obviously explain why you've been given certain marks for certain questions. So even if you're not successful in applying to this competition, you will receive feedback, which then you can use to hopefully improve your ideas in the future. And finally, moving on very briefly to project setup. So successful applicants in this competition will go through to the project setup process within the Innovation Funding Service, which looks a little something like this, with all of the required milestones listed as headings. You as applicants therefore have greater visibility of what you need to complete, and also of what we need to complete at Innovate UK in order to get your project off the ground. So it should speed up the process of actually getting projects started. And each of these headings must show as complete before we can issue you with a grant offer letter, which is when you can actually go and start your project. So one important milestone that we've highlighted today is the return of the signed collaboration agreement, which obviously we require for all collaborative projects. This stipulates the relationship within the consortium, and from my experience is probably the most common cause for delay in project starting due to complex things such as IP agreements, for example. So please do start working on these as early as possible to avoid potential further delays further down the line. And once you have actually started your project, it is important to know that grant is always paid quarterly and in arrears, and you can only claim grant against costs which have actually been incurred and defrayed during that project period in question. You therefore need to be careful with your cash flow and cost management. And finally, projects over 6 months long, so projects for the second phase of this competition, will also be subject to quarterly monitoring by an appointed Innovate UK monitoring officer. Okay, thank you very much for listening today, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay. Do questions and answers of Philip and Joe.
Thank you. Céline from Element Energy. You made the point that new companies can put that they have zero turnover, etc. How would they claim the cost if they haven't paid themselves any salary yet?
So the information that you would put in is just upfront information as part of your application.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just things like turnover and profit and that kind of thing that you'd put in. If that doesn't exist yet, then you can simply leave that for now. And then when it comes to your project starting, obviously then it's a slightly different matter, and you'll be able to pay yourself by then. So it's only for newly incorporated organisations that haven't really got going yet. But by the time the project starts, they will be a fully trading organisation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I've got in mind the company already exists, but they don't have any cash flow, and they don't pay themselves an income yet, the directors, for instance. So when it comes to cost, they can say we're going to spend that many days doing this study, but they cannot justify the salary because they don't have evidence this is what they paid themselves before.
So if there's no salary being paid
yet,
then as part of your labour cost, you can use sort of projected estimations. And then what will happen is if you are successful in applying to the competition, we will carry out our viability check and eligibility check on all participants. So we will then liaise to you to basically finalise your project costs and make sure they're completely eligible and accurate before you actually start your project. So you can use estimates if you don't know exactly what the labour costs are going to be before you start your project.
Thank you.
And I would just add to that that you just, in the written part of the application, you give as much explanation as to how you plan to do it and why you've done it that way, I suppose.
I have a question with the first part of the presentation. You mentioned that if the organization already have Innovate UK funding, you cannot apply. Is that right?
So that's only if you've got Innovate UK funding and you've not completed your final independent accounts report for a previously ended project.
Okay, so the
you
project
can
needs to be ended completely.
So yes, it needs to be ended and you need to have not submitted your final claims in your independence account report. You
Okay.
can have multiple projects
And
ongoing.
so in terms of the ending date, does it have to end before I submit a new application, or does it have to end before my potentially new project starts?
You can have multiple projects ongoing in tandem as long as you've got the capacity.
Yeah.
It's more for if a project has finished in the past
And you
and you
have to
haven't
complete it,
submitted the
I
necessary
see.
paperwork, that will then stop your
Okay,
ability.
I
There's
see.
nothing to stop you from having multiple projects going at once.
That's clear, thank you.
Yeah, I would just say it's to stop bad behaviour. That's probably the wrong term, but bad behaviour in the sense that we have lots of companies, lots of projects that don't complete their paperwork as completely as they should, and that rule allows us to potentially consider not giving you any more if there has been some bad behaviour in the past in terms of completing the paperwork.
Hi, Richard Clements, Connected Curb. I just have a question in relation to the IP sharing. How does that work? Traditionally, I've not done a great deal of Innovate UK funding myself, so I'm just interested to know. Obviously, we own the IP currently that we have, and we're not that happy at sharing it with somebody.
So we're not experts ourselves into IP, and we don't actually get involved in the collaboration agreements as such. I'm not sure, Neil, if you've got any information you can provide.
Yeah, so the IP situation is for the project themselves to sort out with the partners that you're collaborating with. We don't get directly involved. We can signpost you to some suitable collaboration agreement templates and some information on our website. But in terms of actually how you structure the IP and the foreground IP and the background IP, that's for you to take advice on and work out as part of your collaboration agreement.
Yeah, I would second that. Take IP advice. One usual rule is that if you've got IP and you put it into the project, you retain that IP. Any IP coming out of the project, that's up to you to share, but take advice.
There's no essential penalties associated with that in any way?
No. We don't take any direct interest in the IP. We just want to see that you've thought about it with your collaboration partners as part of the application, that you've got a plan in place to how to deal with it to everybody's satisfaction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Stuart Russell from the Energy Systems Catapult, and my question is about catapults. Usually our status is a research organisation in these competitions. Is that the case? Or I notice as a public sector.
Yes, I think it's just usual standard rules. Catapults would be regarded as research organisations.
Any questions from the webcast, Jenny? No. Okay.
Can we partner with a council?
Apparently, yes. I'm getting a nod, so yes, that would be perfectly fine in this case.
Yeah, so there has to be a minimum of 2 partners. That could be 2 business partners. It could be a business partner and a council or a research organisation, but there has to be a business, and the business has to be the lead.
Thanks.
But as we touched upon in the scope, to be able to achieve the objectives of your project, you need to tell us that the consortium is the right configuration to achieve that. So the more complex your project is, the more partners you might need to deliver what you're saying you're going to deliver.
So we could partner with multiple councils?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
We've not put any limits on the number of partners in the project. That's for you to tell us what the best configuration is
But
within the reams of possibility in terms of the dates that we're asking you to deliver the project by. Obviously, a project involving 20 plus partners might become completely unmanageable.
And I think the thing to always look out for here is that the maximum research proportion of total project costs that we have in place is 30%. So essentially any organisation that is eligible to receive 100% funding, their costs can only total up to 30% of the total across the project. So you can't have lots and lots and lots of different organisations all receiving 100% if their project costs are going to take you above the 30% threshold.
Any further questions? No. Nope. One more. Okay.
What's the quantum of the total amounts here? Because it seems like originally it was 40 million in total, and they were split down into the induction for medium to light vehicles, and then you've said there's 5 to 10 million to apply for on a project basis. So have you shifted the amount that you're allocating for each of those areas?
Shall I answer this?
Yeah, go.
So notionally we've got £40 million for the two competitions, and that's notionally split 20 million for each. But we've said quite clearly in the online information that obviously the funders reserve the right to move the funds around depending on where the demand comes from. We also have an indication of how much money we're going to spend at phase 1 compared to phase 2, and that's driven by obviously budgets. But again, we've got some flexibility in that if circumstances demand.
So
what you're applying for here is for the phase 1 projects only.
Okay. And what is the total amount that you're allocating for phase 1 projects? Or have you set that? Have you established that yet?
Yeah, that was on the screen earlier on.
No, that's individual projects. The total quantum for that.
For the induction one was 600K. For the on-street one was 750.
Is that
for phase 1?
That's the total amount of that pot?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, thank you, Philip and Joe.